All right, so we're back and ready to jump into another deep dive with a really fascinating situation developing in Ukraine.
Yeah, there's a lot going on over there.
Absolutely. And we've got 3 articles today, kind of all circling around this idea of peace talks, mineral deals, and well, a war that's still very much happening.
Right. How do those all fit together?
Yeah, that's what we're trying to figure out. So
Mhm.
the first article, I guess, kind of sets the stage right. It talks about this meeting between President Trump and the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer.
Okay.
And they're discussing, a potential peace deal for Ukraine. And Trump seems pretty confident that Putin would actually honor a peace agreement.
Hmm. That's interesting, given, Putin's history.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
makes you wonder what makes him so sure. But the article suggests that Trump sees this potential U.S. involvement in Ukraine's mineral sector as like a deterrent.
Almost like a guarantee, right? Like if we're invested, Russia won't want to mess things up.
Yeah, like a you break it, you buy it kind of thing. But in this
Hmm.
case, it's more like you break it, we invest in it.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But it's not like everyone agrees with that approach. The article mentions that Starmer is pushing for more traditional security guarantees, maybe a European-led peacekeeping force.
So 2 very different ideas about how to keep the peace.
Exactly. And it really highlights the different philosophies at play here.
Okay, so let's say they do manage to hammer out a peace agreement. There's still this question of territory, right? Would Russia have to return the land they've already taken?
Well, that's a big sticking point for
Yeah.
sure. The article says Trump wants to get as much as we can back for Ukraine, but he doesn't really give any specifics.
And he didn't seem to agree with Starmer that Putin would likely invade again without those strong security measures in place.
Right. So it makes you wonder how much of this optimism from Trump is, genuine belief in Putin and how much is maybe tied to this mineral deal he's pushing for.
Interesting. Well, that brings us to the second article, which gets into this, shall we say, complicated relationship between Trump and Zelensky.
Oh, yeah, this is where things get a little messy.
A little messy is an understatement. The article reminds us that Trump has said some pretty outrageous things about Zelensky in the past.
Like calling him a dictator without elections, which is just plain wrong.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine does hold elections. It's not exactly a dictatorship.
Not even close.
Yeah.
And he also blamed Ukraine for starting the war with Russia, which is also demonstrably false.
So there's a lot of baggage there, to say the least.
Yeah, you could say that.
But despite all that, they're still planning to meet and potentially finalize this massive mineral deal.
Yeah, it's quite a turnaround. And this deal is no small thing. We're talking about giving the U.S. a huge chunk of Ukraine's future earnings from their natural resources.
Wait, so not just oil and gas, but also those critical minerals like titanium and graphite.
Exactly. Those are used in all sorts of high-tech stuff like electronics and even aerospace technology. So we're talking about some seriously valuable resources here.
I see where this is going. There are going to be some concerns about this deal.
Oh, absolutely. The article kind of dances around the specifics, which is already a bit of a red flag. It refers to half the value of relevant Ukrainian government-owned natural resource assets. But that phrase is incredibly vague.
Yeah, what exactly does relevant mean in this context? And how do you even determine the value of these assets in a country that's actively at war?
Right. And on top of that, there's this question of whether Ukraine can actually deliver on the financial returns that Trump seems to be promising.
Yeah, their infrastructure is devastated. They're struggling to keep the lights on in some places. It's hard to imagine them suddenly becoming this mineral exporting powerhouse.
And that leads to another concern highlighted in the article.
Yeah.
The potential for U.S. personnel having to go into Ukraine to extract these minerals.
Yeah, that raises all sorts of issues about safety, escalating tensions with Russia, and it just feels a bit uncomfortable, Like, are we taking advantage of a country in a really vulnerable position?
It's definitely a valid concern. And it brings us to a really important point. Even if this deal is presented as a way to help Ukraine, it could very easily backfire and cause more problems than it solves.
It's a good thing we have that third article to give us a bit more context.
Yeah, because that one takes us right to the ground level.
No, really to a mine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it paints a very different picture than these grand pronouncements about Ukraine's mineral wealth. So this article takes us inside a titanium mine in Irshansk. It's in eastern Ukraine, and it's a bit of a reality check, I'd say.
Yeah, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty here, seeing what's actually happening on the ground.
Exactly. And what they're finding is that this mine is facing some serious challenges. Like, just getting enough electricity is a daily struggle.
Really? How bad is it?
Well, the article says they're lucky if they get 3 hours of power per day. Imagine trying to run a mine with that little electricity.
Wow, that's rough. And I bet that impacts their ability to, actually extract and process the titanium.
Oh, absolutely. The mine director, Dmytro Holik, is quoted in the article saying, "We don't know how our work will go on even tomorrow." So there's a lot of uncertainty, to say the least.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the kind of place that's about to start raking in billions of dollars in profits.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
And it really makes you question those optimistic projections about Ukraine quickly repaying debts through mineral exports.
Right. If this mine, which is already up and running, is struggling this much, what does that say about the feasibility of scaling up production across the whole country?
It definitely throws some cold water on that idea. And it makes you wonder if the U.S. government is fully aware of these challenges or if they're maybe downplaying them to make this deal seem more appealing.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And speaking of the deal, the article points out that it specifically excludes current sources of revenues.
Right. So basically, the U.S. wouldn't be profiting from resources that are already contributing to Ukraine's budget. It's all about future potential.
Which, as we've just discussed, is incredibly uncertain.
Exactly. And that uncertainty raises another red flag: transparency. The agreement mentions half the value of relevant Ukrainian government-owned natural resource assets. But those terms are so vague.
Yeah, how do you even define relevant in this context? And who decides what the value of these assets is, especially in a war zone?
It feels like there's a lot of room for interpretation, which could lead to one side getting a much better deal than the other.
It almost feels like there's a disconnect between those negotiating this deal and the people who would actually be doing the work on the ground.
Right. Are they really aware of the day-to-day struggles of these miners and the challenges they face? It's a question worth asking.
Absolutely. And the article also touches on the potential for U.S. personnel coming in to extract these minerals.
Yeah, that's a bit of a thorny issue, isn't it?
On the one hand, you could argue that it brings in expertise and investment that Ukraine desperately needs, but on the other hand, it could be seen as exploitative, like the U.S. is swooping in to take advantage of a vulnerable nation.
It's definitely a sensitive topic. And let's not forget the potential for this to escalate tensions with Russia. They made it very clear that they see Ukraine as within their sphere of influence, and this kind of U.S. involvement could be seen as a provocation.
So this seemingly simple mineral deal is actually a tangled web of economic interests, political maneuvering, and potential for conflict.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we need to look beyond the surface and really examine the potential consequences of these actions.
Well said. So the article goes on to talk about the specific types of minerals that Ukraine has. What stood out to you there?
Well, it confirms that they do have significant deposits of things like titanium, graphite, and lithium. All those are in high demand globally. But the article also acknowledges that a lot of this potential wealth is really difficult to get to.
Especially given the current state of the country.
Exactly. They even quote a geologist who says it is very difficult to talk about the actual value of these deposits because it takes so much investment to extract them, process them, and get them to market.
Right. It's not like they can just dig a hole and start selling these things. It's a complex process that requires a lot of resources and a stable environment.
Which is something that Ukraine is definitely lacking right now.
Yeah, the article also highlights the challenges of even knowing how much of these minerals Ukraine actually has.
Right, they're relying on Soviet-era data, which might not be accurate. And that makes it even harder to evaluate the potential of this deal.
It's like we're being asked to make a decision with a blindfold on.
It definitely raises some serious concerns about transparency and whether all the parties involved are being upfront about the risks and the potential rewards.
Okay, so to illustrate this point, the article gives this very specific example of the Zaporizhia Industrial Aluminum Integrated Plant.
Yes, this was the one that U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz touted as a potential source of aluminum for the U.S.
Right, but the article points out that this plant has been shut down for a decade and it even got hit by a missile at some point.
Not exactly a plug-and-play solution.
Nope. And it really makes you question the validity of Waltz's claims and whether the U.S. government is being honest about the challenges involved here.
It also makes you wonder if there are other examples like this where the reality on the ground doesn't match the rosy picture being painted by those pushing for this deal.
Right. It's a good reminder to be skeptical and to dig a little deeper.
Exactly. We can't just accept things at face value. We need to do our own research and come to our own conclusions.
So we've covered a lot of ground here: peace talks, this controversial mineral deal, and all the uncertainty surrounding Ukraine's future. What are some of the long-term implications of all this for both Ukraine and the U.S.?
Well, the potential impacts are huge, both economically and geopolitically. On the one hand, this deal could be a lifeline for Ukraine.
Helping them rebuild their economy and create jobs.
Exactly. And it could strengthen ties with the U.S., creating a strategic partnership.
But we've also uncovered some pretty serious risks.
Definitely. There's the potential for exploitation, with the U.S. profiting from Ukraine's resources without providing fair compensation. And there's the risk of escalating tensions with Russia, which could lead to more instability in the region.
And what about sustainability? Can Ukraine really afford to give up such a large share of its future earnings?
That's a big question. And it's important to remember that all of this is happening against the backdrop of a war, which adds another layer of complexity.
It's like trying to build a house during an earthquake.
Exactly. The urgency of the situation could lead to hasty decisions that don't serve Ukraine's best interests in the long run.
So how do we ensure that Ukraine's future is protected?
Well, the article mentions that there seems to be some differing interpretations of the deal between the U.S. and Ukraine.
Really? In what way?
It seems like the U.S. is focused on the short-term potential for Ukraine to quickly generate revenue and repay debts, while Ukrainian officials are more cautious, emphasizing the need for investment and development before those resources can be fully utilized.
So there's a potential for miscommunication and unmet expectations down the line.
Absolutely. And that highlights the need for clear communication and transparency from all parties involved.
This whole situation really puts Ukraine's natural resources at the center of the conversation about peace and economic recovery. But as we've discussed, it's a very delicate balancing act.
Yeah, it's not a simple equation, and there's no guarantee that this deal will lead to either peace or prosperity for Ukraine.
So where do we go from here? How do we reconcile these competing interests and make sure that Ukraine has a sustainable future?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we balance these competing interests and ensure that Ukraine benefits in the long run?
It seems like a tall order, especially with so much at stake.
It definitely is. But I think a key part of it is empowering Ukraine to make its own decisions about its future.
So not just dictating terms from afar, but actually listening to what Ukrainians want and need.
Exactly. It's about respecting their sovereignty and their right to control their own resources.
And that means investing in their future in a way that promotes sustainable development, not just quick profits.
Right. It's about helping them build a strong and independent economy, not just extracting resources and leaving them to deal with the consequences.
So this mineral deal could be a step in the right direction, but only if it's done with careful consideration and a genuine commitment to Ukraine's long-term well-being.
Absolutely. It's a chance to forge a true partnership, one based on mutual respect and shared goals.
And that requires transparency from all parties involved. Both the U.S. and Ukraine need to be upfront about their intentions and their expectations.
Transparency is crucial because it builds trust and prevents misunderstandings down the line.
It also allows the international community to hold everyone accountable and ensure that this deal doesn't become another example of exploitation.
Right. It's about making sure that Ukraine's resources benefit the Ukrainian people and not just foreign corporations or governments.
So ultimately, it's not just about the minerals themselves, it's about the kind of future we want to create for Ukraine.
Exactly. Do we want to see them become a prosperous and independent nation? Or do we want to see them become another victim of resource exploitation?
It's a choice we have to make. And it's a choice that will have ripple effects far beyond Ukraine.
It's a reminder that our actions have consequences and that we need to think carefully about the impact we're having on the world.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive, and I hope it's encouraged our listeners to think critically about this complex situation.
Me too. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines, but it's important to dig deeper and examine the nuances of these issues.
And to remember that there are real people's lives at stake here.
Absolutely. The decisions we make today will have a lasting impact on the future of Ukraine and its people.
So let's all do our part to stay informed, ask tough questions, and demand better from our leaders.
Because ultimately, it's up to all of us to create a more just and equitable world.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we hope you'll continue to explore these critical issues with us in the future.